More than 1,500 hours of classroom instruction, plus a year's worth of apprenticeship. Now, that is our state's outsized requirement for becoming a barber in North Carolina. So why such a heavy burden for this profession? Well, the ugly origins of North Carolina's barber licensing requirement is the subject of a fascinating piece written by Jon Sanders. Jon is Director of Regulatory Studies here at the Locke Foundation. He joins me now to talk about some history and some rules that we really should be looking at very carefully. Jon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Donna.
What caught your eye about this? In other words, why did you decide to write about the heavy burden of licensing on barbers?
Well, because we have gotten into the question of looking at what kind of training police have, and it was brought up before the General Assembly that, we require over 1,500 hours for barbers to be trained, and we don't require near that much for policemen. And the thrust of those comments was, the state is more interested in making sure barbers get more training than police. But knowing the history of the barber's license, these are two completely separate issues, and we don't want to be applying those kind of standards to police. Definitely, we need to look at police training, and those need to be the sorts of issues that people need to look at, but not in the context of why, barbers get more training than police. The reason barbers have so much training is a pretty ugly history.
It really is. And so you were listening to this discussion about this ongoing discussion that we're having in our country about police and policing. And when you heard that comment made at the General Assembly, you kind of separated that out from the discussion of police training and said, this really has some history to it here in our state that we should talk about and try to move forward from. As you mentioned, it's an ugly history, and it dates back decades. Tell us about why North Carolina barbers have such a heavy burden in order to practice their trade.
Well, it goes back to the progressives and progressive racism, unfortunately. Barbers' licenses aren't the only sort of thing. And we've looked at other policies here, but in the 19th century, after the Civil War was ended in emancipation, former slaves were going to work for themselves, and one of the things where they were very successful at was in barbering. And in North Carolina and many other places, the majority of barbers were blacks, and the way that they were building themselves up as entrepreneurs and building their communities and reinvesting was through this trade. One of the biggest examples is John Merrick from Durham, who ended up founding North Carolina Mutual to help insure blacks. So it was a wonderful example of entrepreneurship in America. But the white barbers decided they didn't like this competition, and they wanted somehow legally to put their black competitors out of business. And so what they did was they went to the state to regulate, and they made it where you needed to go to school, and you needed to accomplish so much apprenticeship, and you needed to be able to fill out testing. And these struck at chords of racism within North Carolina, within the United States. This was not just a North Carolina thing. This was all over the United States.
So these rules made it very difficult for anyone, but in this case, you're saying that it really went back to people in this state and others who held very reprehensible, ugly views about African Americans at that time, and in order to try to essentially keep them out of being successful and earning a living and supporting their families, they tried to make it really, really tough. So they added all of these rules of all sorts of licenses or hours of instruction, etc. But what is also interesting is that even with those barriers up, there were people of all races who said, okay, that's a tough hill to climb, but I can do that. And they went ahead and did.
Well, they did. The reason it was a problem for blacks, though, was because in the South at the time especially, they were They weren't given the same sort of educational opportunities. They were not given the same sort of professional opportunities. So it kind of struck at them in a way that, looked on paper legally to be just valid and not race-based, but the intent was definitely race-based.
So, Jon, this story, and you've written about it in a very interesting way, and people can read this piece at johnlocke.org to read more about the history, but you also make a larger point, and that is that to this day we have all sorts of unfair, anti-competitive rules in place for barbers and hosts of other professions that make it really tough for people to earn a living. And that is one of your points as well, to look at the barber situation, but also to realize that to this day we have unfair rules.
Absolutely. I mean, my response to the standards police versus barbering was, well, why in the world do we require over 1,500 hours for barbers of training plus another year? I mean, most states don't even go that far. But we have the same problem in a lot of professions in North Carolina where we require occupational licensing. The General Assembly just recently passed a bill that will make it easier for veterans and their spouses and military spouses who move to North Carolina to get a job, because licensing makes it hard for them to do that, but they have to move around a lot. So they don't have the time to acquire the standards that the state's requiring.
Jon, you have also written previously about ways to address this, to move forward so that people can have an easier time to practice their skill or their trade and support themselves, earn a living, raise their family, and all of that. That doesn't require actual licensing. But here's the pushback that we hear a lot. People will say, well, we need to have all of these rules in place because whether it's barbers or other professions, they have the potential to hurt people. It's a public health question or a public safety question. But you write that there are other ways that could protect everyone.
Well, most professions have professional certification organizations that will ensure those sorts of things. And that's part of the training. And you can have disclosure to your clients that you show what kind of certification that you have. And if without licensing in many of these instances, there will be a greater push for that because consumers will want to know, and you will want as a provider to advertise, you're really good at this. You know what you're doing.
And so, Jon, it's very interesting, the piece that you wrote, not only about what's happening with barbers in North Carolina, and to this day, this is the incredible burden and the requirement in order to become a barber in this state. Jon, is there any appetite in the General Assembly to actually cut this back?
With respect to barbers, I don't think so. However, there is a bill right now for universal license recognition, which Arizona and recently Iowa have passed, which is a good idea, which would allow, similar to the Veterans Bill.